Today, I want to talk a little bit of a follow-up on the last class, and it has to do more about the securitization of the leases. So there are times when you may have, or there might be a good concept with a new startup, or they have a very good background, but it might be difficult since it's a new startup to get certain landlords to want to agree to a typical security deposit. So typically what we're looking at is 1, maybe 2 months of security deposit for a company that is well established and has decent financials. So there are some landlords, however, and just keep this in mind, that they will insist on a personal guarantee for just about any company, even some large corporate national type brands. And that's just an understanding that, if it doesn't match with your tenant, with the landlord, then it's just not a property that they're probably just going to go into. So bear that in mind. Now, there are different ways and tricks that you can, or I don't want to say tricks, but different ways to securitize a lease other than just a large security deposit. Okay. So number one, we mentioned that before, it is a personal guarantee. So if you have maybe it's a brand new company that's starting up that doesn't have that many, that strong financials, or a franchisee that's starting up with a good, nice brand, but they, again, don't have the financials or wherewithal for the company to securitize the lease themselves, then they might go with a personal guarantee. Personal guarantees can be a full guarantee, or it can be a limited guarantee. So that's something that you want to work out. And when you're representing the tenant, understand that, the highest risk of a tenant falling out of business is probably the first year. Close to 90% of businesses fail in the first year, especially like restaurants, things like that. That goes up slight percentage every year, but not after about the third year, it's pretty stable. And if a business has succeeded for 3 years, then they are much less likely to default on the lease terms unless there's a big change in the leases. Maybe they took on a lot of additional space and things like that. So with that in mind, some of the things that you can do is perhaps a larger short-term security deposit. And I've seen some security deposits as much as 2 years worth of term. Initially. And when you go with that, or if the landlord's asking for that, then if you're representing the tenant, the response should be, one, try and get it down a little bit more, but also what you're going to want to do is have it so that it burns down. So after the first year, perhaps it's a 1-year guarantee, but after the first year, it goes down to 6 months. After the second year, it may go down to 3 months or 4 months. After the third year, maybe you're back to a traditional 2-month security deposit. So that's one of the methods that you can utilize in that aspect. It can be used in conjunction with personal guarantees as well. Also, keep in mind that a personal guarantee doesn't have to be from the operator. It can also be from a partner or some other entity that may have a vested interest in the company. If for whatever reasons, I've even seen personal guarantees with family members. Where the father came in or the parents came in and they gave a personal guarantee on the child's business that they're operating because they had financial wherewithal and they really believed in it. So that's something to take into consideration as well. The other method, which is common but not as common, is what we call an LC, or letter of credit. Okay, so a letter of credit essentially is a letter that is drafted by a bank or financial institution on behalf of the landlord or in favor of the landlord, that basically states that if there is a default or breach within the lease term, the landlord can call the letter of credit due, and immediately then the bank or financial institution will then send the amount of the letter of credit to the landlord. Now, to get a letter of credit, the tenant still must have assets. It might be personal assets. It could, you can get a letter of credit from the, let's say the private person, as opposed to the company. The owner of the company may have a lot of personal assets, but they don't want to give a personal guarantee. So instead, they attach the personal assets to what they call a letter of credit. So typically speaking, you need to have either deposits in the bank, or if it's a financial institution that's giving the letter of credit, some sort of non-volatile type stock or bonds, things like that. So what you're using for the letter of credit is the assets as the security. So if a landlord were to call the letter of credit due, the financial institution would either sell the assets or liquidate the assets and then pay that letter of credit. Now, one of the things to be very aware of when you are working with a letter of credit is that the letter of credit you can design it in a way so that it expires and goes down, every year as well. You can actually potentially start with a much higher letter of credit, like a 2-year letter of credit, and then from there burn it down to 18 months, 12 months, and then 6 months, and then potentially after the 4th year, 0. Or just a regular security deposit. It can also be used in conjunction with a security deposit. It can also be used in conjunction with a personal guarantee or limited personal guarantee. One of the things, though, if you are representing the tenant, that you want to make sure in the letter of credit, the language that you have is you do not want it so that the letter of credit is triggered with a default, but rather if there's a breach. So the difference between a default and a breach is a default is the tenant not performing something on the lease. And it can be something as simple as not maintaining the parking lot, or they stored some chemicals that they were supposed to notify the landlord of, or they might be a day late in the rent. Okay, the rent may have been sent out, it wasn't done electronically, it's sent via mail, and it hasn't been received by the first, third, fifth, however the lease is set up to do. So that's a default. A breach is when the tenant has the opportunity to cure that default but has not. So for you, if you're representing a tenant and you're doing a letter of credit, you obviously don't want to have it as a default, because then if they just make one little mistake that could be just an oversight, a minor oversight, then that tenant could potentially be liable. That letter of credit could be called. However, if it's a breach, then there has to be a breach for the letter of credit to be called. Then what ends up happening is the landlord will have to notify the tenant they're in default. The tenant has a right to cure that default before it goes into breach. Typically, it's anywhere from 5, 10, 15 days, depending on how the lease is structured. And then if the tenant doesn't cure the default, then it becomes a breach, and then the landlord can call the letter of credit due. So these are different ways. It's a little bit higher level when it comes just a straight standard, here's your 1-month security deposit or 2-month security deposit. There are different opportunities to securitize that lease if you have to get creative, especially with newer companies coming in or franchisees coming in that may not have financial wherewithal of the entire corporation. So when you structure that, really getting to understand and know your client, what their needs are, even before you write the offer, so you know how to structure it. The last thing you want to do as a broker is start writing an offer for a lease and then understand that the financial strength of the tenant is not that strong. So you've spent all that time researching, finding property, finding the right property, and all of a sudden they can't qualify for it. So find out ahead of time and then propose different ideas. If they're not that strong financially, you can come in. I mean, the big question we always have, who's going to guarantee the lease? If they say that the company's going to guarantee the lease, realistically, you as the tenant rep should be asking, how long has the company been in business? Can you send me the financials? Make sure they can qualify for the lease. If there's no finances on the company, nobody's going to accept that as a guarantee. No landlord will accept that as a guarantee. Brand new company starting up with no financial strength or proven track record or sales, no landlord's going to accept that. So you have to be upfront with your tenant and say, as a new company, we may have to look at other ways to securitize the lease to make the landlord comfortable with your use. Also, be fully aware that the prime properties, the best properties that are out there, the best locations that are out there, landlords tend to be pickier on who the tenants are. They also tend to want a higher securitization. You're paying a much higher rent and you're securitizing that. So lastly, the security and tenants have to understand, because a lot of times they'll come back in and say, well, if we're giving you a 1-year letter of credit, that's more than enough time to securitize or to find a new subtenant potentially for that space, and that's all that the landlord should worry about. Well, putting the shoe on the other foot, the landlord has incurred a lot of other additional costs. One, they've already paid a commission up front. They may have given tenant improvements or concessions with free rent, given a tenant improvement allowance of $30, $40, $50, $60 a square foot, whatever it may be. So it's not just the rent that the landlord's trying to securitize, but the entire lease and all their expenditures. Be aware that, when a tenant comes to you and says, well, really it shouldn't be more than a 6-month or 1-year security deposit, that realistically for a landlord, that could be just the concessions and the commissions. It has nothing to do with the rent. So that's why landlords will ask for a much higher security deposit, especially if the company is not that strong or out there. Again, keep in mind, some landlords don't care about the strength of the company. They always try and get a personal guarantee. I actually had a landlord we were working with at one time and brought in a tenant that was, of all things, Microsoft. And he was still trying to find a guarantee. One of the strongest companies in the world, and they wanted somebody to personally guarantee the lease. Obviously, that didn't happen. But be aware of that, and that's on the other side as well. When you're talking to your landlords, be very upfront. McDonald's is not going to give a security deposit. If you want McDonald's, they're going to be there. And the strength of McDonald's is the strength of what they have. Same goes for certain other companies like CVS, Walgreens, most fast food companies. They just don't give a security deposit. So be aware of that. Now, if it's a franchisee on a fast food deposit, you might be able to get a personal guarantee, but typically you do not see a security deposit. You had a question?
Yeah, well, if they're not strong financially personally, where's the personal guarantee coming from?
If they're not strong financially personally, the personal guarantee is worth nothing, and one shouldn't even be working with that client. If they don't have strong company financials and they don't have strong personal financials, they're just not a client, really. I mean, everybody has a dream, but not too many people can execute that dream. So, if you want to start a business, if you want to do that, you have to understand that there are other companies. Now, the other option in that situation is you don't start off in a location or one of the top prime areas. If you're looking in a C minus location, D even location, some of those landlords are a little bit looser when it comes to the securitization of leases. I've seen where they will accept just about anybody. But that is a completely different neighborhood. Understand what your clients are looking for in the neighborhood and what their business is going to be most successful at.